In picking a model church, what you're wanting to do when you get on the mission field. One of the reasons why I say it is so important to get on the church field and learn the context, learn the culture. I'm speaking to you out of experience. When I first started going to Uganda in 1998, I was working with another missionary, and we began to plant churches the way that he had been planting churches. And he had started a school, and I was all about the school and about training pastors. And one of the things that we did was to plant churches according to his model. Now, one model is to know what kind of church that you want to plant. So oftentimes we take our own culture in there. And I've included a slide here to show you. This is me preaching at that church. You'll notice that it has a stage, it has a pulpit, it has a baptistry, it has a Lord's Supper table down front, it has flowers in front. You'll even notice that the lights above are old chandeliers that came out of churches here in America. Now, what we have here is a beautiful church. As a matter of fact, it's built like an African banda. And the reason for building this church is because Baptists were not known in that area. And giving them a permanent structure really raised the level of Baptist in that area of Uganda. It gave them some legitimacy. It is a wonderful church, a wonderful building, and it has seen a very fruitful ministry over these last 25 years. Now, the interesting thing is about this church, because unconsciously, what we were doing, we were building a church according to the model that we were familiar with. We noticed that men began to scour the countryside looking for suit coats and suits because we preached in suits and ties. If you'll notice in this picture, I'm beginning to wise up. This picture was taken years later, and you'll see that I'm wearing a safari shirt, which is a very dress shirt over in Africa, but it's not a suit. And I'm wearing just my regular missionary pants. This was after I was living in Uganda, and this is me traveling back and preaching at this church. Now, here's what I want to point out to you. Because we use the American model, I began to see some weaknesses in this church. For example, everything that was done in the church was done pretty much in the same manner as would be done in any Southern Baptist church in America. We met, there was Sunday school, there was a time of singing and worship, and then there was the preaching of the word, the invitation. And as I said, this church really had a good ministry, a solid ministry by American standards. We would preach, the service would be about an hour and 15 minutes long on average. Then they would fellowship after church and have tea and go about their merry way. They would come back and have night service just like we do here in America. But again, that's the American church transplanted into a foreign culture. Several years later, I began to notice that this church began to act like the American church. They began watching their watches to see when the service was over with. They began to do what we did on Sundays. They would come for morning service. They would not come back for evening service. Um, and all the maladies that the American church had, I began to see mimicked in this American church that simply happened to be in Africa. Now, I will say this, there were a lot of missionaries, a lot of foreigners who came to this church because it made them feel a little bit more like home. So I'm not saying that it is not a good model, I'm just saying that it is perhaps not the best model. Let me show you a better model. Now, this is a church that we did not impose any organization on at all, other than telling them that they need to have a pastor, they needed to have deacons, there needed to be ministry, the Lord's Supper, baptism, just those doctrinal things. But this church, as you can see, is brightly colored, as the African culture is. They love loud colors and bright colors. But we also noticed something else, that when we left them alone and allowed them to formalize the church around their own culture, Africans in this area, and this is an area of Rulinkoli, and church is the event. The service does not have any time schedule whatsoever. They meet and they begin to sing. And they may sing for 30 minutes, they may sing for an hour, they may sing for an hour and a half. It is that singing that is really the call to worship as the music drifts through the air, down the valleys, and people begin to say, oh, it's time for church. And the crowd begins to grow. Many of these people that you see in this picture will walk some 15 to 20 kilometers just to get to church. Now, beloved, they're not there for a 45-minute Sunday school and an hour-long worship service. They've walked over 10 miles. They're there to worship. This is their event for that day. They may start singing at 9:30. It may be 10 o'clock. They may sing until noon. They may preach until 2. They may preach till 3. They may have fellowship on the grounds together and then come back and preach again on up into the night. But that's their culture. So we need to give them the freedom to develop a model. What does that model look like in America? Americans would not stand for it. Americans would not have time to spend literally all day at church. These people will spend, I say, no less than 4 hours on Sunday at church all together, and sometimes 8, 10, 12 hours a day on a Sunday. They are event oriented, so you have to be very, very careful when you're thinking about a model and you start thinking about it in your frame of reference. Allow them to say, hey, you need singing in the service. How long you sing, that's up to you. Somebody needs to share out of God's word. How long? Well, that's up to you. And what I noticed is churches that are contextualized actually seem to do better in the long term, because it is not a discarding of their culture, but it is rather their culture coming to Christ. And that's an easier transition for many of them. So let me encourage you, and I do not take this lightly. I want to encourage you. You may have heard me say something that seemed disparaging among the cell church, Beloved, the cell church works well in a context that understands what a cell group is. But to force a cell group on a community, on a culture that does not understand well, it's not the best choice. So let me encourage you again to really pray about when you go on the field, when you're looking at what type of church you're going to plant. Remember to look really at the context and contextualize the church growth, the church planting approach that you're going to use. I want you all the success in the world. I really do. And that's why I want you to prayerfully consider this and apply this. If you don't learn anything else, learn this from the mistakes and the experience of others.